This is the Italian Real Estate Podcast, here to help you with the ins and outs and basics of Italian real estate, presented by ItalianRealEstateLawyers.com. Hello there, and welcome back to another episode of the Italian Real Estate Podcast, presented by ItalianRealEstateLawyers.com. Of course, we are back at it again with Italian attorney Marco Permunian. How you doing, man?
Good, how are you?
I am doing great, thank you. And today, we wanted to do a part two, a follow-up to our episode on talking about getting around Italy, transportation in Italy. And last time I mentioned at the end of that episode that we wanted to not only talk about getting around Italy, but getting to and from Italy. But I think just before we get into the whole getting to and from Italy, flying to Italy, let's maybe talk a little bit more about getting around Italy, because there's still so much more to cover. Last time we talked a lot about getting around by car and by train and by metro and a little bit about bus and so on. But there's still plenty more to get into. So Marco, where is it that you would like to get started in this second part of our transportation little series that we're doing here?
Yeah, and like I said the other time in the other video, when purchasing properties in Italy, one of the first questions that myself and my team are asked is, what should I take into consideration when buying a property in Italy in terms of how do I get around in Italy? Should I buy a property near an airport? Should I buy a property in the countryside? And if so, how can I reach the next big city if I'm in the countryside? So I believe, the other time we talked about cars and, like you said, trains and metros. But what happens if you buy a property in a town that is kind of isolated? Well, we should clarify that in Italy, there are no really isolated places like we see in other countries. For example, in Northern Europe or even in America, because if you live even in the smallest town in Italy, unless it's a town on the top of a mountain, you'll find that it's normally very close to the next town. However, if you live in a small town, the only transportation means that you will find could be a bus. And if it's a small town, it's probably going to be not the most beautiful bus and not the quickest, but at least there will probably be one bus stop in your little village. But if you don't want to use a bus, the only way to get around from your little village could be car. So a lot of people think about renting a car or buying a car when they move to Italy. And one of the questions that people normally ask me is, how fast can you drive in Italy? What are the speed limits? And should I be extremely careful? Is there some flexibility? Well, the limits are normally 50 kilometers per hour if you're driving in the city center. Or, and this is probably the most common, 70 kilometers per hour if you are driving outside of a city center in a normal road. And then the next most common speed limit is 130 kilometers per hour if you're driving in a highway, one of the highways that we talked about in the previous episodes that you have to pay for. But if it's a highway that you don't have to pay for, so a normal highway, the speed limit will probably be either 90 or 110. So in Italy, the speed limits are relatively low, so you can't really drive more than 130 kilometers per hour, which is not super fast, but that's what it is. And you have to be very careful at the speed limits because there are cameras everywhere in Italy, and that's one way for the local governments and municipalities to, get money to support themselves. They try to catch the people who speed through these cameras that are pretty much everywhere. So be extremely careful when driving in Italy, because it's very likely to get a ticket if you're not respecting the speed limits.
It's interesting to think about these ways of getting around, and especially if you are taking into consideration also, like you were saying, about getting to an airport that your clients do often ask you, should you be close to one? I mean, the thing is, you'll never be all that far away from an airport. Even the furthest that you could be would be maybe a few hours, but it's always going to be within the realm of possibility to get to some airport in the country. But does it make sense in Italy, domestically, like to fly within the borders of Italy, to fly, or would you choose another method of transportation when getting around?
That's an interesting question. And I'd say that domestic flights in Italy are not common. So if you're moving from one place to the other in Italy, it's likely that you're not using an airplane. There are some exceptions. For example, if you're going from the very north to the very south of the country, meaning from the region where you were living, in Trentino, Alto Adige, or even my region, the Veneto region, to Sicily, which is an island. And by the way, there is no bridge between Italy as the peninsula and the island of Sicily. They've been talking about building a bridge for a while, years, but they never
many
did
years.
that in many years, very many. And you know, at every election they keep talking about building this bridge. They keep, but that's a whole other topic.
Right.
So if you have to fly from the north of Italy to Sicily, then it makes a lot of sense to use an airplane, and it's probably a 1.5 hours flight. But there are people that drive from the north to Sicily. It's a 12 to 13 hours drive, which is a lot for an Italian, but not so many hours maybe for an American. And of course, you have to take a boat that will take your car from the Italian peninsula to the island of Sicily. So there are people that choose to still go by car. And the same applies to Sardinia. It makes sense to fly there because there is no bridge that will take you to Sardinia. And the only option would be to use a ferry, so a boat that will take your car from to Sardinia. But there are people, like in the example that I just made for Sicily, that will choose to drive to Sardinia. So it's not very common to use an airplane. Oh, and a lot of people, they go on vacation from northern Italy to Puglia, which is another very beautiful region, which is not an island. It's probably one of the most southern region of Italy. And even if it's probably a 9 to 10 hours drive, a lot of people, they choose to drive there because they want to use their own car when they go on vacation to Puglia. But I'd say you are like at the very limit. Some people will choose to get on an airplane if they live in northern Italy and to rent a car at the airport. But the thing is, with the prices of gas and even renting a car that have gone up very much lately, a lot of people will be inclined to choose to fly there rather than going by car.
Yeah, and actually, just one other quick option that if somebody is wanting to go from the north or somewhat central Italy to Sicily, not only is there the car ferry, but that same car ferry not only just transports cars, but will also actually transport trains. Not all of the ferries, but there is a train ferry as well as a car ferry. And I've known plenty of people who've done that trip. It's an overnight trip that you can take, and they've really enjoyed because you can go along the coast and have some views. And it's an experience. It's a unique experience to be able to have when you're in Italy, because there's not many places in the world. Maybe that one is the only one. But to go on a train that goes on a boat, that's a whole other idea right there.
Yeah, and we've been talking about traveling long distance in Italy by plane or by car, but we haven't mentioned the train. I know we talked about the train extensively in the other episode that we recorded before this one, but the thing is, if you need to travel from the very north of Italy to a region in southern Italy, using the train could be the best choice, a high speed train, especially if you're going to, say, Naples, because it's very well connected to Rome and Florence and Bologna and a bunch of other cities in northern Italy. Only maybe the region of Puglia is not so well connected if you were to travel by train, because you basically reach a certain point and then you have to get on a regional train, which is very slow. And a lot of people that want to go on vacation to Puglia, there are beautiful beaches there, they are unable to do so by train because the region of Puglia specifically is not so well connected. But if you're going, for example, to Naples and the area around Naples from the north of Italy, using the high-speed train might just be the best solution and much better than going by car and much better than using an airplane.
Yeah, I believe another region that kind of has a similar situation to Puglia is Calabria, where it's a little bit difficult to get by train. Definitely, I would say in Italy, if you're going to be traveling around by train, the north is much better connected than the south. The north has much more modern new trains and a lot more stations. You have ability to get around the south, but from what I've heard also from friends of mine, that it's also more reliable in the north. Just of course, it depends on where you are and where you're trying to get to, because not all small towns will have one. Sometimes a small village will rely on a provincial capital for their train transport, and you either have to drive there or by car or by bus. But these are all things that are worth taking into consideration. How far from these things, how many modes of transportation? Do you want to have a direct path to get to where you need to go? Do you want to have an airport close by? Because there are plenty of places in Italy where you can live within maybe 1 hour or 2 hours or 3 hours of an airport and have it be pretty convenient to get there. But then there's other places where you could live within the same physical distance, but it would be impossible to get there within the same day on public transport, just depending again on where you're going from and where you're going to. But I think also within this conversation about the traveling within Italy long distance, it's also worth talking about, and then also talking about as well, connecting the idea of being able to be close for an American, especially, or for your clients from other nations, that they want to be able to get home. What are the best ways to travel to Italy? I know there's a lot of direct flights, but then there's also a lot of indirect flights. What are some of your tips for traveling to Italy?
Well, as you said, there are a lot of direct flights and a lot of indirect flights where you might just find yourself traveling through another European country. I know the airport in Rome, Naples, and the airport in Venice are very well connected to the rest of the world. But if you're going to fly into a smaller airport, you may just need to go through another European country. And of course, it always depends on where you're coming from and the airlines and the agreements between airlines. And but I've seen that, especially if you're coming from America, the Venice airport and the Rome airport are the ones that you should probably look into if you're looking for a direct flight. And like we said, those airports are very well connected to the rest of the country. And of course, the airport in Milan is probably the third one airport that I would suggest if you're traveling internationally. So to recap, Rome, Milan, and Venice are the airports that probably you should choose if you're looking for a direct flight. And all three cities have transportation means that will allow you to travel from there to the rest of the country. For example, in Rome, you'll have the subway that takes you from the airport to the city, and then from the city you can take the train. And depending on which airport you arrive to in Milan, you'll be able to do the same. Maybe the airport in Venice is the one that is not so well connected to the rest of the country, but there are buses that will take you to the city, and from there you can go anywhere in the country.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. And then also, just actually one thing I'll give my 2 cents here about the airports is also, I think it depends as well where in the world that you're traveling to, especially if you're traveling to North America. Of course, Rome, Venice, and Malpensa are going to be some of the best airports. But if you're going to be traveling within Europe, then it's worthwhile comparing and contrasting, because there are some smaller airports with budget airlines that can be very easy and very cost effective to get to. And then also, even depending on where you find yourself, like say, for example, you're in Padova in the north of Italy. From that one position, you have the 2 Venice airports plus Bergamo, plus Bologna, plus Verona, all very, very, very accessible from that location. And so it's worthwhile comparing and contrasting, depending on where you're trying to fly to, the flights from those different airports, because from that position, theoretically, it's pretty realistic to get to really any of those airports. If you wanted to go to fly from the Bologna airport, it's an airport that I actually like and find it very easy to get from the airport to the central train station. Actually, even since the last time that I flew through there, they've added a monorail that goes from the airport to the train station, which makes it really, really easy. And so it not only can sometimes be a very cost-effective airport when flying within Europe, but it also is a very convenient one if you're needing to get to another place within that rough area of Italy.
Yeah, definitely. And as you just said, if you're flying internationally, then you should probably consider the biggest airport and the most known airlines. But if you're flying domestically or within the EU, there are specific airlines that you should choose because they have very cheap tickets. Those flights will probably leave from the minor airports. For example, they will not leave often from the Marco Polo airport in Venice, but rather they will leave from the Treviso airport, which is still considered, an airport serving the city of Venice, but it's a much smaller one. Or if you're leaving from Milan, you won't be using the Malpensa airport, which is the international airport. Rather, you will be using the Linate airport, which is a smaller airport covering the city of Milan, or even Bergamo, which is still considered an airport serving the city of Milan. And Ryanair and EasyJet, which are the two airlines that you normally use to fly around Europe, which are probably the cheapest ones, normally will leave. Those flights will leave from these minor airports rather than the big airports that we talked about before.
Yeah, no, it's really great to have those budget options. And when we're talking about budget flights in Europe, we do mean budget, especially if you plan it out just right and you plan a little bit ahead of time and you're only going with like carry-on and maybe you're going for 2 or 3 days. You can get a flight I've seen them as low as €7, €8, not 700, not 7D, €7 to get from one place to another. Not always round trip for that cheap. Maybe you'll have to spend 15 or 20 euros for a round trip ticket, but that's if you really plan it well. You can often find tickets around 50, 100. If you're spending 200 or less, you're doing pretty good, in my opinion, when you're finding these budget airlines. And once you're getting that 150, 200 range, that's already starting to be like all right, this is a pretty pricey price at that point, but usually you'll be able to have some luggage with you, priority check-in, and some airlines and airports you'll have a faster security line. Sometimes, depending on the airport, the faster security line is not even going to be worthwhile going through because it's going to be just as fast as the normal one. Actually, I did it in Palermo. I paid an extra, I don't know, €5, €10 for it because I had never been to the Palermo airport before, and I wanted to make sure like everything went well. And it was the same place, and there was nobody checking in through security when I was there, so it made absolutely zero difference. But there are other airports where it can be worthwhile, and having that priority security clearance to get through, or the security priority line. And also, if you print your ticket ahead of time at home or at a print shop, that will be free. But if you have to go and print the ticket and check in person at the airport, then they might charge you extra. You just have to keep an eye on all of the little details because they upsell every last little detail, other than the rumored charge for the bathroom. They never made that a thing. They thought about it. A lot of these airlines thought about it, but that's the one thing that they haven't started charging extra for yet.
Yeah, but talking about going from one European country to the other, while the airplane is normally the choice that people make, it's not impossible to travel from one country to the other by car. And and the first thing that is probably worthwhile mentioning is that you can travel from one EU country to the other without being stopped. There are no borders, because in the European Union, we said it many times, there are no borders, no matter if you are an EU citizen or a non-EU citizen, once you are in the EU and you're traveling by car, there are no borders anymore. You will
Yeah.
see the old borders, and you will see the old offices where the police was staying when they were actually
Yeah.
stopping all the cars crossing the border. They are now empty because nobody works there anymore. So
Right.
that's one of the beautiful things about the EU as it is today, as opposed as the different single countries that we had before the borders were eliminated. And
Right.
I mean, they might just still stop some cars to do some random checks, but it's
Yeah.
very uncommon. And they used to do it during the health emergency more than ever,
Yeah.
but otherwise, you just drive straight. And the thing is, Italy is a relatively small country. So if you have to go to Austria, or you have to go to Switzerland, or to Croatia, or even to France, it might just make sense to go by car if you're not going
Yeah.
too far away. And of course, the signs and the speed limits will change. So you have to be maybe careful. There will be maybe cameras that you have to be careful about, because the speed limits will be different. But it's not unusual for somebody to travel by car from Italy to, say, Germany. Of course, if you have to go to Latvia, for example, you will have to use an airplane because it's far away, but it's not impossible to reach it even by car, especially for Americans that drive long distance and without breaking a sweat. It's something that it's not so crazy when you talk about driving from Italy to Latvia, which is kind of far away. Maybe it's like more crazy for an Italian to do that, but if you are an American, it's definitely doable.
It's like driving from California to Washington, basically. I mean, even to drive, say, I'm trying to think, I forget exactly off the top of my head, but I want to say from Verona to Munich, I think you could drive it in like 4 hours or something.
Yeah, I think it's like
4.5
5 hours. Yeah.
5 hours makes sense. Yeah, it's really not that a big a deal. I mean, even like I know from Bolzano, when I lived up in that area, I had a lot of friends that would drive up and they would go back and forth, or even to Innsbruck in Austria. That's just like you drive up, and it's the strangest thing that you're driving on the highway. I haven't done the drive from Italy to Germany, but I've done other borders across the European Union, and you're just driving, and it's all of a sudden there's the little sign with the country, and it's like maybe a little slash over it to say you're not in that country anymore, or just welcome to whatever country you're in. No stop, nothing. I mean, even some places the border could just be a bridge. And when you're on the other side of the bridge, that means you're in another country. Or it could be that you just have to cross a street. Borders in Europe, it's really an amazing thing. I mean, there's even a town in Belgium / the Netherlands that is literally divided. Like some blocks are in the Netherlands, some blocks are in Belgium, and some buildings, depending on where the door is, can be whatever. It's a whole different country with a whole different thing. This is the Italian real estate podcast. Let's focus on Italy. But it really is amazing to be able to have those options, even not just driving, but I'll add even train travel from Italy to other countries is definitely doable, especially in the north of the country. A lot of people hear about the Eurail pass, and it's very pricey. I would say in some cases it can be worthwhile, but in other cases, taking just a regular train ride and just paying for that international train and paying for it normally can be worthwhile. If you're not going, you have to really, really use the Eurail pass. But I believe that you do have a couple of years on some of them at the very least to be able to have that option of getting the full benefit from it. But sometimes the trains from Italy to, say, you can get a train from Milan to Lugano. That's a very easy ride to get to a very beautiful place in Switzerland. It does happen to be in the Italian part of the country, and it's a beautiful location.
Yeah, and the thing is, like, the train system in Europe tends to be very good, not only in Italy, but also in the other European countries. So it's not unusual to find people that want to travel throughout Europe by train rather than by airplane. And there is this website which allows you to buy tickets specifically to travel from one EU country to the other, even if you have maybe to change trains or if basically the ticket, you'll have to buy maybe 2 tickets rather than one to get from Italy to Paris by train, but it's totally possible. It's not that you have to get off the train and then maybe walk and then get on another train. It's all one thing, it's all connected, and it's totally doable. Or if you have to go from Italy to Spain, for example, by train, of course, it's not the most efficient means of transportation, but if you want to enjoy or like go on a somewhat different vacation, you can totally do that because the train system is all connected in Europe, and at least in Western Europe, as far as I could tell. And it's totally doable to take a long trip by train.
So just out of curiosity, what was that website that you were mentioning where you found some tickets to get around Europe?
So the one that I know of is called thetrainline.com, but I was checking before we recorded this episode and I saw there are actually several new websites. And then, for example, I'm checking now, we have omio.it and raileurope.com. So it looks like we have like some new websites. And I know that thetrainline.com is probably one of the oldest and most known, but it's interesting to see that we have some new ones, which shows how possible it is to travel from one EU country to the other by train.
Yeah. Oh, definitely. I mean, also, when we're talking about some of these long distance travel routes, you do not only have just trains and planes, but actually buses. There's actually one bus line called Flixbus, and they were running some really ridiculous prices for at least their initial kind of coming out and coming onto the market. But you can still find some pretty decent rates around Europe to get from, say, one major city to another. I mean, from Paris to Berlin, Hamburg to Milan, whatever it may be, you'll probably have some ability to find some bus there. But even like you were talking about before about the train that you could take theoretically from Italy all the way over to Spain. I mean, that ride from roughly about Genova over in the direction of Nice and beyond, you're riding along the ocean. It's a beautiful train ride. I did it many years ago when I was a kid, and it was such a crazy experience to have. Just you're riding along and you have these beautiful views, seeing these beautiful places, beautiful just sharp cliffs that come crashing down into the water. And yeah, to be able to get to the borders of these countries and experience that you go through, and you have a different language in some of these different stops. It's along the way. It's a very unique experience. I mean, even from Italy to Nice, the train line goes through Monaco. And the Monaco station is underground, and you don't really see Monaco so much because it's a very small area. But theoretically, you can get off, have an afternoon in Monaco, and then go on and make your way to Nice.
Yeah, and before we end up this episode, I was talking to a friend the other day who was telling me how he booked plane tickets from Italy to Barcelona in the morning, and the return flight was at night. So basically, he went to Barcelona for a very cheap price because, like you said before, he was planning way in advance, and he was able to use, I think, Ryanair or EasyJet, and he went to basically Barcelona for lunch, and he was back at night.
I've actually thought about doing stuff like that before, but let's see. I may have to do that one of these days. I mean, because I have family in different parts of the continent, and to get around, it's definitely within the realm of reality if you plan it just right. Anyway. Another topic for another day, but thank you again, Marco, for making yourself available. And of course, if anybody is interested in purchasing property in Italy and getting help with making Italy their home, how can they get in contact with you and your team?
People can contact us through our website, italianrealestatelawyers.com, or give us a call. Our number is on the website.
Well, that's great. And of course, if you're interested in more content about Italian real estate, be sure that you're subscribed to the YouTube channel as well as the audio-only podcast. But by being subscribed to the YouTube channel, you're also automatically subscribed to the Italian Citizenship Podcast, another project that Marco and I collaborate on, where we talk about the legalities of moving to Italy, as well as getting Italian citizenship. And also, if you're interested in more content about life abroad, and living abroad as an Italian dual citizen expat, be sure to come over to my YouTube channel, youtube.com/Marco youtube.com/Rafael Di Furia, or you can search for Not Your Average Globetrotter and also find the audio-only podcast. But of course, Mr. Marco Permunian, thank you so much for making yourself available for this episode of the Italian Real Estate Podcast, brought to you by ItalianRealEstateLawyers.com. Of course, I'm Rafael Di Furia. Stay safe and healthy out there, and we will see you all next time. Later.
Thank you.